Welcome to the How to Program with Java podcast, where all you need is the desire to learn, and you too can become a Java programmer with absolutely no knowledge of programming. And now, your host, Trevor Page.
Ladies and gentlemen, how you doing, guys? It's always a pleasure to be back at the How to Program with Java podcast headquarters here in, near Toronto, Ontario, Canada. And I am primed and ready to bring to you another fantastic episode. This time we're going to be focusing, obviously, on our ongoing series, a topic of HTML, but we're specifically going to be focusing on the design elements of HTML. Now, not the design elements in such a way that, how could I put this button here, and how could I, what color could I make this button to make the design really pop and all that stuff, but more so the technical aspects as they pertain to design. So not what color should I make that button, but how do I change the color of that button, if that makes sense. So more specifically, though, we're going to be focusing on how to put elements on your website and how to tell them exactly how to position themselves within the website itself. But anyway, before we get into more details on that, I'll start off with the 5-star reviews that have come in as of late. We had one come in from Italy, which may or may not be the first review from Italy. I'm not positive. This one came a few days back now. There might be more that have come in, but I haven't refreshed or been able to refresh my list of reviews. So if you sent yours in and you haven't heard it, don't worry, it'll be on the next episode. So this one, like I said, comes in from, looks like username, M. Contagallo. Not sure if that's pronouncing it right, but whatever. Music for programmers or Java programmers' ears is what they say. 5-star review. They say, great job, Trevor. This podcast is really interesting and useful. So it doesn't get any shorter and sweeter than that. Thank you so much for leaving that 5-star review. I know it takes some time out of your day, the precious minutes and hours that you have in your day. If you feel like taking those precious minutes and applying them to the How to Program with Java podcast, then I will love you forever. You can go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/love, and you can share your love for the podcast and leave a rating and a review. Very important that you also leave a review, because if you don't also leave that review on top of the rating, then I won't be able to read it at the top of the next episode. So, there you have it. All right, so we're in episode, 65 now, I think? Let me just check my show notes. Yeah, it looks like episode 65. And like I hinted at the beginning, we're going to be talking about some HTML layout and design stuff. So, there's two... the way I see it, there's a progression. There has been a progression of how to create websites in terms of how to design them and how to put the design together in terms of the actual coding itself. Way back when I first started, design was all about creating tables. And you can think of a table it's kind of like an Excel spreadsheet. We have rows and columns inside of your table. And you would be able to specify your website and specify how many rows and columns it should have. And this was sort of like how it was done. So you'd create, let's say if you had a standard, like a blog, usually blogs are 2 columns. So the left-hand side column will be the main content, and the right-hand side column tends to be like the sidebar where all the, ads and stuff like that get shoved. Not unlike my website and how it's laid out now. But that's typically how it is done. And then the number, so that's 2 columns, and the number of rows really, will be dynamic in terms of how much content you really want to put into that particular website. So for every column you insert, there's sort of like it's almost like a page break, or there's a little bit of a gap that it gives you between the content above and the content below. And you could nest in these tables as well. So you can create a table within a table within a table within a table. So what that means is inside of one of the rows and one of the columns, you can create a whole other table that could be made up of several rows and columns, and you can nest them within each other. And this was, this got the job done. But it was fairly tedious, right? Creating tables among tables inside of tables, and rows and rows and columns. it gets very tiring very quickly. But like I said, that was sort of how the when I first started HTML, that's just sort of how you designed it. That's how it was done. But by doing it that way, it's like I said, it's very difficult, and it's very difficult because the rows and the columns, namely the columns, the width of the columns would sort of readjust themselves based on the amount of content within that particular column itself. So if you had a 2-column layout, and you had, let's say you want it to be sort of 75% on one column and 25% on the other, if you had a lot of content in that 25% column, so the one on the right, it would expand to be 30% or 40% or 50%, and that would be very frustrating. So you have to put in additional properties to say, okay, I want to set a maximum width for this column, and so on and so forth. And it, like I said, it just got a little bit tedious. But having said that, there's still absolutely a purpose for tables. Specifically, like if I can use from my own little entrepreneurial career, whenever you're setting up pricing tables. So if you go to javavideotutorials.net, which is where I sell these wonderful Java video tutorials that I'm sure you guys know about. If I haven't talked about it recently, my apologies. If you're looking for a great tutorial series that's full video that seriously students have been raving about, they keep emailing me saying that this is they've tried to learn Java 6, 7, 8 times before and they've failed every single time. But then they started with my course and they're already 6 chapters in and they don't see themselves stopping and they're really excited. Anyway. That's some shameless self-promotion there, just to say it's great. But if you go to javavideotutorials.net, you scroll down to where the pricing section is, that is a table. Okay, and it's a table because it should be a table. It's called a pricing table, so it makes sense that it should be broken down kind of like an Excel spreadsheet, right? You have your columns, which are sort of the plans. So you have your starter plan, your dedicated plan, your all-in plan, and your platinum plan. And for each of those plans, there's rows that describe what comes as a part of that plan. Okay, as well as the prices, and as well as the buttons where you can actually, hit them and say, I want to sign up for this one. So that makes sense. That is a design that fits the purpose. Okay, so the purpose of the pricing table is to be just that. But the purpose of a web page as a whole is not to be a table per se. Okay, it doesn't fit that nuance. So what you want to do is you want to upgrade your design. You don't want to be using full tables and rows and columns for every single part of your website. You want to improve it. So that's where the div tag comes into play. Div is D-I-V. It's kind of like a divide or a division. You can sort of say that you want a certain block of content to appear in any part or any aspect of your web page. All right. So, for example, let's go back to my original talk about my website, my blog, and a lot of other blogs out there. There's 2 columns, but you could also sort of think of those 2 columns as 2 different blocks. 2 different areas where you want to assign content, okay? And these areas are more or less fixed in terms of their size and their width, or rather their width, maybe not so much their height, because maybe you want their height to be dynamic, but maybe you want to set their width, and you can do this with the div tags. Okay, and the reason why I like these better is because they're very, very flexible. Okay, they give you a behavior that is somewhat expected. Okay, they don't tend to do strange things like when you're dealing with tables and when you have been dealing with tables for many, many years like I had, you wrestle with them. That's the best explanation I can give to dealing with tables. It's you're constantly in a state of wrestling with them to get them to look and feel exactly the way you want them to look and feel. So very frustrating. Whereas divs are a lot less frustrating. So a lot of the applications of the 2 are similar. It's just that the div does a much more elegant job of getting the job done. If you follow my meaning there. So div tags, probably one of the most powerful tools at your disposal for designing your web page. Period. But having said that, like I said, web page design and web pages in general, and the internet in general, is an evolving beast. Okay? So everything that I'm going to tell you in this lecture, we can sort of say it's going to evolve, and it already has been evolving. And I can say this because I know I've used it before. the design for web pages these days is trending towards mobile responsive. So let me give this little talk before we get into the div tag specifically, just so you guys have a full disclosure on what's going on. So a lot of web page design is moving towards mobile friendly and mobile responsive design. So what the heck does that even mean? Well, that means that the web page will actually physically look differently depending on the device in which you are viewing the website. So if you're on your desktop, it'll look one way. If you're on a tablet, it'll look a different way. And if you're on your mobile phone, it will look even more different as well. Okay, and which makes sense because the experience that you have on a website is fundamentally different when you're on a desktop, whereas when you're on your mobile phone, namely because of screen real estate. So good examples of how mobile design works is if you look at the homepage for how to program with java.com, I coded that to be mobile responsive. So what you see on the desktop is you'll see a big picture of me to sort of give you an idea of who I am and what I stand for, and then a little blurb about how to become a professional, Java programmer and what you can do to achieve your goal of becoming a professional. And I encourage you to sign up for the mailing list because you're going to get lots of great stuff to achieve that goal and resources and tools and whatnot. So that's the experience that you get when you come on your mobile or on your desktop device, on your whatever, your laptop or your big clunky desktop. That's what you see. Whereas when you go on your mobile phone, the picture of me, the big picture of me, smiling and giving you that sense of oh, this is a real person and it makes me feel comfortable and loved and all that stuff. Anyway, you don't see that picture of me on the mobile phone. All right. And it's not because I don't want to, give off those same feelings of comfort and, you can relate to this person and all that stuff. It's because it would be a little bit distracting. It would take away from the function of the website, okay, on the mobile phone. So what happens is the picture does not appear at all. All that appears is, hey, you're here because you want to be a Java guy. You want to learn about Java. You want to be a pro. You want to impress your mom with all the stuff that you know about Java. So I give you the ability to sign up for that newsletter, that email list for the tools and the resources and all that stuff I talked about. That is still there. You just don't have the big clunky picture of me because, like I said, it would take away from the experience. All right. That's an example of mobile responsive. It automatically figures out what kind of device you're on and adjusts the website accordingly. Now, of course, in order for that to happen, there's obviously programming that's involved in that. And yes, that's absolutely true. There is programming involved in that. There is more work involved in making a website responsive versus just having a website, be not responsive, okay? So like I said, this is definitely a trend that mobile, website design is moving towards, and there's no doubt about it. Okay, it's here, and more websites are taking advantage of this extra code. It's more work, like I said, but they're taking advantage of it because it just makes for a better experience for the user who's actually visiting your website. All right, so having said that, we are definitely going to be touching on mobile responsive design. I'm definitely going to be teaching that stuff. There are some great, plugins and tools that you can use to make your life a lot easier when it comes to designing websites and making them mobile responsive. Okay, so no worries, be at ease. You're going to learn that stuff. However, you still need to learn about what I was talking about before, this div tag stuff, as well as tables. We'll talk about tables, obviously, because like I said, there's a time and a place for tables. So this talk is going to be focusing on the div tag. Cool? Cool. Like I said, the div tag is universally, as of right now, universally the go-to, design element for your website. It makes up the foundation of your entire website, and even the mobile responsive stuff definitely makes use of the div tag as well. All right, so it's not like a div tag doesn't exist when you're talking about mobile responsive design. It definitely does. So that's why it's important to learn about it. Cool. So, like I said, div tags are used to sort of identify blocks, areas inside of your web page that you want to have, laid out in some way, shape, or form. Like I said, if you want to have two different, general areas of content to appear, then you'd have two div elements, okay? If you want to have, a header, the content, and a footer, and a sidebar, okay? Those are, header, footer, sidebar, main content. Those are 4 different divs that you can assign to all those 4 areas of your website. All right, so that's the sort of the frame of mind that I have whenever I'm deciding if I should create a div tag. Okay, and I just keep saying div tag. Well, how do you create a div tag? Well, it's exactly what it sounds like. You create an HTML tag, which is the less than sign, with the word div inside of it, div, and then you close your angled bracket, which is the greater than sign. Done. And obviously then you have your opening tag and your closing tag, which is less than sign with the /div and then greater than sign. Okay. These are HTML tags. They work just like any other HTML tag, but you're specifying an area of your website. Now, what I have in a tutorial that I have created. It was a little while ago that I created this, but it's still valid, of course. If you go to howtoprogramwithjava.com/session65, that'll be the show notes for this page. You'll be able to go and see the examples of the div tag that I have been talking about. All right. Now, like I said, I've prefaced this with the fact that mobile responsive design is big and is a trend. So everything that I'm teaching in this article is sort of in contrast to, strictly speaking, mobile responsive design. These are things that if you wanted your website to be mobile responsive, then this is just not the approach you'd want to take. But that is the case for any code that you're going to be writing if you're not writing code specifically for mobile design. Anything you write is going to have to be changed anyway. So it's really up to you to decide how you want your website to work. If you're just learning about this for the first time, let's not worry about mobile responsive. Okay, let's learn to crawl before we walk. Okay, so crawling first is learning how to use a div tag and modifying it and shaping it as we want it to work. All right, so that'll be my little disclaimer for this, because I know people are going to start complaining and saying, well, this is not good code. You shouldn't be writing it this way, and so on and so forth. And I'm just saying you need to learn how to crawl first. Okay, there's got to be a start. So for those of you who are angry right now, that means that you already know how to do this stuff. So you shouldn't be even listening to this episode right now. You need to go on to the more advanced stuff. All right, cool. So, like I said, let's learn how to create this web page with like the header, the footer, and the 2 parts of the content. So, let's say the 3/4 of this page is main content, and 1/4 of the page is sort of the sidebar. So, like I said, just like my blog itself. So, like I said, we need to decide sort of how wide these areas should be, maybe even how tall the areas should be, and where exactly these areas should appear on the website. And every time I say area, I really mean the div tag. How should we create the div tag? So, if we were to create the div tags based on the, let's say, 3/4 and 1/4 layout, one thing that's important to understand is, well, every computer will render the page in a certain way. So, depending on the size of the monitor or the device that you're using, depending on the size of the browser that they're using, maybe it's not maximized, maybe it's sort of take up half their screen. It's really, you need to sort of choose the size of the areas that would make the most sense to the most people. Okay, because you can imagine there are so many devices out there. There are so many different types of monitors out there. There's so many different types of resolution values being used. Like, I use a very high resolution value. Okay, I'm at I don't even know what my computer's set at right now. Let me check. But I know it's a fairly decently high value with respect to the actual screen real estate itself. So let me go here. Let me right click on my desktop. Let me go to my screen resolution. So I'm at I'm just at 1920 by 1080. So I'm at essentially 1080p. Okay, is my the screen resolution that I am using on my desktop computer. Okay, so that really means that I have what 1080p means. I have 1920 pixels across and around 1080 up and down in terms of height. So if the average person is using 1080p, then they the average person uses a maximized web browser screen, so the browser itself is maximized, then the average person will be using 1920 pixels in width for your website or for their websites that they're browsing. Okay, so that would be, if that were the case, then you should design your website to take advantage of all 1920 pixels, right? But that is obviously not the case. Not everybody in the world browses the internet with their browser maximized. Like me, I don't do that. I have it, sort of maybe taking up 75% of my screen in terms of width, maybe even less than that, okay? So that means that I don't use up 1,920 pixels. I use somewhere around maybe 70 or 60% of those pixels. So this is where you kind of, pick a value out of the air that sort of makes sense to you. And for this example that I chose, I said, let's assume that 1,000 pixels in width would make sense for the content to be appearing as inside of the web page. So we'll make use of 1,000 pixels in width. Fair enough. All right, that's a good old average. So if we're assuming that the average person is okay with viewing 1,000 pixels in width for a website, that means that we want to break up those 1,000 pixels in terms of 3/4 on the left and 1/4 on the right. What does that mean? Well, that means 750 pixels will be used on the left-hand side of the screen for the left-hand side, the main content, if you will. Whereas 25% of that, which is, 250 pixels, will be used in the right-hand side for the sidebar, okay? So main content, 750, sidebar content, 250, okay? Those added together equals 1,000 pixels in width, which is what we've said the average person would be okay with. Obviously, this is just a guess, okay? Because if you're on a mobile phone and I've set up the website to be 1,000 pixels in width, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to try to render the web page in the mobile phone, but what's going to happen is it's going to be tiny, tiny, tiny text because it has to fit 1,000 pixels into the size, the width of your screen, which if you're looking in, portrait mode, not landscape, but portrait, how many pixels in width does your portrait phone have? That's, I don't know, maybe 200 pixels, 260. I really don't know. And again, it varies depending on the device. So you can see how much of a nightmare this is for guessing, how to lay out your website. So what's going to happen is if my website is 1,000 pixels in width, and the device I'm viewing on only has 250 pixels in width, it's going to have to zoom out the website to be at 25% size. So it's going to have to shrink the text down by 25%, shrink the images down to 25%, shrink everything down to be 25% so that it'll fit the width of the screen. And then what's going to happen is when they want to read the content, they're going to have to pinch and zoom in to the device, right? That is if you've ever been to a website that's not mobile optimized, that's what you're going to do. That's the experience you're going to have. You're going to be pinching and zooming because it's going to try to fit so many, thousands of pixels onto your mobile phone, which just can't support that many pixels. All right? Cool. So that is the situation that we are dealing with. But again, like I said, we're just crawling before we walk. So let's assume that 1,000 pixels in width is fine, and we can set the 750 and 250 pixels in width for each of our div sort of containers, if you will. So how do we do this? How do we create a div that we want to have, being around 750 pixels in width? So you create a div tag, like I said. Create the div tag, and then you need to start setting properties inside of it, or attributes. I forget now what to call them, but again, I'm just going to use those terms interchangeably as I speak through these tutorials because I keep forgetting. Actually, you know what? Let me look it up now and be done with it once and for all. It looks like these are properties, so I'm obviously not very good with terminologies when it comes to these things because there's so many terminologies to remember. Let's call HTML properties. Do that and take a look and see what the interwebs has to say about it. So the CSS property groups, this is what I'm looking at. So color, background, blah, 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 text, animation, table. So it looks like, all right, so these are called properties. So they're not attributes, they're properties. Okay, so I'm going to have to get that through my thick skull and remember that from now on. So the property that we are going to be assigning to the div tag is going to be the style property. Okay, and if you remember the style property, we were talking about this from our CSS talk. Okay, style, assigning a style property to a div tag is using inline CSS. Okay, that is the example that I've used here because it's just the easiest to illustrate in terms of a coding example instead of having to, extract out the CSS property into a separate CSS file and include those separately. You can absolutely do it that way as well if you like, but it's easier to just show it as an inline block of code. All right, cool. So you create your div tag. So you do your less than sign div space style property. So style equals, and then you put inside of your double quotes your the actual styles that you want to apply to this particular div. Okay, this div element. What are the styles? Well, like we said, we want to assign the width. So I'm going to assign width, and I'm going to put my colon, and I'm going to type in the pixels that I want this particular div to be in terms of the width. So I'm going to put 750 px. Px is an abbreviation for pixels. Okay, and then we put our semicolon, we close our quote, and we close our angled bracket to finish off the div, the opening div tag anyway. And then obviously we need to create our closing div tag, angled bracket / div. Done. Cool. So now we've created this div. We've specified that it should be 750 pixels in width, and now within the div itself, we can start typing out whatever it is that we want to type in. So this could be the content. Okay, so the content we just type right inside. We nest it inside of the div tag itself. That is where the content goes. And whatever content we put in here, the div will force it to be 750 pixels in width. Okay, so I show you that as an example inside of the show notes page. Again, howtoprogramwithjava.com/session 65. You'll be able to see exactly what that looks like. All right, cool. But then let's say that we want to also have our right hand side, the what's it called? The sidebar. Okay, so let's create another div. We can create it just below the first one that we have initially created. So below our first div, we're going to create another one. So another opening div tag with a style property and equals, we put inside of our double quotes, the width. So what width is it that we want to use for the sidebar, you might ask? Well, you should know. 250 pixels. That's what we decided on, 750, 250. So this is going to be the sidebar. So we're going to say style equals width, colon, 250, px. Again, px standing for pixels. Semicolon, close quote, close angled bracket, and close our div tag with another closing, obviously, div tag. And then we can put in the content in there as the sidebar stuff. All right, so when we do that, what is going to be the result? You might expect it to look exactly, the right way. You expect it to have, the content on the left, displaying on the left, and the content like in the sidebar that should be on the right. But what happens is it just displays them on top of each other. So it displays the main sort of content first in the appropriate width. So if you put a bunch of content in there, it will sort of, do carriage returns, or not, what are they, carriage returns? Yeah, I guess they'd be carriage returns appropriately when it tries to go beyond the 750 pixels. So it'll just wrap the text. I guess that's a better way to talk about it. Not carriage returns, but it'll wrap the text appropriately when it hits that 750 pixel boundary marker. All right. So that'll work just fine. But like I said, the sidebar content, which you would have expected to be just to the right of the main content, is not. It is below it. So why is that? Well, it's happening because divs work in something called a block display mode. Okay, so block display mode means that it tries to create the content from the far left all the way to the far right. So it tries to take up the full width of the website. So what this first div does is it goes through the full width, but only up until the 750 pixel mark. But it still sort of has this remaining, boundary, this remaining block area that you have identified sort of lingering to the right of it. So there's this imaginary line being drawn through to the right, this block of area to the right of your main content that says you're not allowed to put other content here because I am planting my flag and saying, no, I still maintain the rights to this real estate on your page. So if anyone tries to put anything here, I'm not going to let it happen, so it's going to be knocked down. And that's exactly what happens when you try to put in another div thinking that it's going to go in the right place, it knocks it down. Okay, because it's taking up the full width of the website. All right, fair enough. So how do we tell it not to have this behavior? Okay, well, there's a few ways to do it, but let me go with the way that I've done it originally on the website itself. So I'll go and talk about how the website does it, and then I'll tell you just a simple trick that you can do to make it even a little bit easier. Okay, because when it comes to HTML design, there's probably 100 different ways to do the exact same thing, and only a handful of them are correct. So it's just like programming. All right, cool. So we have created the main content area and the sidebar, and they are not going next to each other. How do we make them go next to each other? Well, we need to specify for the sidebar content, which should be on the right-hand side. You can assign another attribute inside of the property. There we go. That's probably the appropriate way to say it. So by attribute and property, I mean the attribute of float inside of the style property. So remember, we have div style equals, and we've set the width equal to 250 pixels, but that's just one inline CSS comment that we put in there, one inline CSS command, if you will. So we've assigned the width, but we can also assign more things. So now I'm going to assign a float. Floats became a popular attribute to use when sort of developers moved from the table design paradigm, if you will, to the div design paradigm. So like I said, the table design was sort of the older way to do it, and tables work nicely because you'd have two columns that were beside each other, and they lined up perfectly beside each other, and they worked with each other. But when you work to a div design paradigm, where the main design, the backbone of the entire website is based off of div tags, that becomes a little bit more tricky to implement. And that's why we need to introduce something called the float. Float was the sort of solution to this problem that we have here. So when we've assigned the two columns, or rather we want to create two columns with two different divs, but they're not lining up next to each other. Right, so we introduce a float to force the rendering of one or both of the areas, the div blocks, to sort of be either on one side or the other of the website. Okay, so you can assign something called a float left and a float right. So what that does is enables you to forcefully say, okay, for this div section, I want you to always be forcing yourself to be on the right-hand side of the screen. So what it's going to do is go to the right-hand side of the screen. It's going to force the whole contents over and shift it up until it hits some sort of margin or some sort of padding that is in the way of it from another element. Okay, so what essentially happens is it's going to force we want to assign the float right to our sidebar, because the sidebar should be on the right, right? So we assign float right, which is inside of the style property. So style width equals 250, float right. And again, it's float right semicolon. It's a standard CSS naming convention, or rather not naming convention, but syntax there. So, okay, cool. And you might think that that's enough. So it's going to push our div over to the right. So our 250 width div is going to be pushed to the right. But like I said, it only goes up so far as it can go up. So as it stands, there's going to still be a block element in the way, which is the other div, which is above it. So although it's going to be pushed to the right, it's not going to be able to go up and be sort of in line perfectly in terms of vertically speaking with our main content. So essentially what that's going to look like is we're going to have our main content to the left, and depending on the width of the main content, the height of the main content, if the main content is, say, 1,800 words, it's going to look really silly because there's going to be 1,800 words worth of stuff, and then all of a sudden below those 1,800 words, but to the right of it, there's going to be the sidebar. And that's not how sort of a table should look, the table that we're so used to, or that we used to be used to. It's not going to look right because they're not lined up in terms of being right next to each other. It's going to be, one and then the other. So that's not going to cut it. So how do we fix this problem? Well, again, like I said, there's many different ways you can fix this problem. The one way that I describe in the article at howtoprogramwithjava.com/session65 is to add a margin. So what you can do is you can reduce the size of the margin of your the sidebar. So you can assign a margin top. So that, again, this is inside of the style property. You can say margin -top : and then assign it a negative value. So you assign a negative top margin, which literally means that it's taking a div block, assigning a negative margin, which is pushing it up on the page. So it's going to be pushing it up and up and up, however many pixels you want to push it up. And that works just fine, especially if you have sort of static content that's not going to change. So that's why it works perfectly in the example that I have outlined in my show notes page. All right. So in this case, you would use the example that I have, the height or the size of the text that I'm putting in there is only, I think it's 500 in height. Let me just double check that. It looks like it's 500 in height. So because we've assigned the main content to be 500 pixels in height, it's offsetting the sidebar by 500 pixels as well. So what we can do is we can assign a negative margin to that right-hand side content. So in the example that I see here, I've assigned a negative 250 pixel margin top value. I'm not exactly sure why that one worked. I'm sure if I went into detail, I would see that it does work properly. And that's probably because of the content itself I have in there. Maybe it's not taking up the full 500 pixels in height. Maybe it's only taking half of it. So I was able to get away with a negative 250 pixel margin. Margin top, that is. So in any case, all it's doing is it's just pushing up the actual content, the actual sidebar content. What I suggest that you do is you play around with this. You go into your Google Chrome browser or your Firefox browser. Those are the two I'd really recommend that you use, one or the other there. Or if you have to, Internet Explorer. But again, like I said, I really prefer Chrome. So you go into your Chrome, you hit your F12 key, and that'll bring up your developer tools, and you can actually highlight your div, so your right-hand side div, your sidebar, and you can manually configure you can click on the margin top that you set, and you can hit the up and down arrows to change the value itself, and you can watch the result live on the web page right there in front of you. You can watch as the sidebar div moves up and down as you're changing the value of the margin top. Cool? So, or you can just type it in yourself and you'll still see it happen right in front of your face, but it's going to snap. It's going to snap to whatever it was, the value that you typed in. Yeah, that's why I like having fun with the up and down key to move it up and down and see what it does. But okay, so that's one way of doing it. That's the way I show you, and that's sort of the end of the article. And I sort of wipe my hands clean and say, okay, we're done. But there's another way to do it, and the way that I just taught you is, like I said, good if you have static content, meaning the content won't change. But if the content changes in the left-hand side, it could mess up the margins, and then again, you're going to have some funky stuff going on with your sidebar. So what I would recommend instead is if you're going to be looking at a 2-column layout, like I was talking about with the blog, which is very popular way to do your blogs, you can use not only a float right on the sidebar content, but you can do a float left on your main content. So you're assigning 2 different floats in 2 different style properties for the 2 different div areas. All right. What that does is it says, okay, so for the main content div, force it to float to the left. Force it onto the left-hand side of the screen, okay? And it will do so. It will still be on the left-hand side of the screen, so nothing looks different if you want to implement that change. But if you also combine it with the float right to be placed into the sidebar content, the sidebar div, you assign float right there, then, boom, magically they will appear next to each other, and you don't have to fiddle with the margins like we were just talking about. You don't have to assign a margin top. You can get rid of it, and they will appear side by side, perfectly in line with each other, just as you would expect them to look and function. Okay? So that's the beauty of using floats. My one word of caution is that the use of floats, if you really get carried away with them, can really make things quite messy in terms of, dealing with the entire context of your entire design for your entire web page. It can get pretty hairy when you start to use floats heavily. So, I mean, it's tough to really find a perfect solution, but the perfect solution is going to be whatever works for you in your situation that you're dealing with. Okay, so like I said, there's many different ways of solving the same problem. You just have to find the one that works the best for you. Okay, and the only way you're going to know out of the gate which one's going to work best is if you are an absolute expert in HTML, which I've said I'm not. I'm not an expert in HTML. I use HTML. I know how to make websites. I've designed many, many websites with it, but I don't call myself an expert because I don't know off the top of my head how to fix a given problem. All I do is trial and error. Okay, that's what I always believe in. That is a methodology that has never failed me. I just keep trying different things, keep Googling around, keep finding different ways to solve the same problem until I find the one that works. And not only will I find the one that works, I'm also going to learn a lot along the journey, along the way. Okay, and that's what programming is all about. So that is the methodology that I will impart on you, that you will go ahead and use the trial and error method as well and learn as you go, because it's, like I said, it's fantastic. So many different ways to solve the same problem, but the most important thing that you should learn from this entire lecture, this entire podcast episode, is that the div tags are here. They're here to stay for now, and that is how you will go around and create websites, okay? Excellent. And to finish things off, I'm going to say that also the div tags can be nested within each other as well. Just like you can nest tables, you can nest div tags within each other as well. Okay, so you can still create the table and column, and table row column type layouts with the divs in every sense of the word. And they're more flexible, they're more predictable, they're less of a hassle to wrestle around with. Trust me on this. But when the time calls for when you actually need to use a table, you need to use something like an Excel spreadsheet type thing inside of your content, then by all means you can use a table, and we'll go into details about how to use tables in a future episode. Because like I said, there's lots to talk about when it comes to HTML, so strap on your thinking caps, ladies and gentlemen. Cool. Alrighty, so I think now what we can do is we can move on to, I think I had a question that came in from the audience. This one comes from Andy Marsh. He said, would you say that Java is a difficult language to learn as a first language? He says, I remember I tried some Python as it was recommended to me as this first language to use before he learned about Java. So the question is Java a difficult first language to learn? Now, I can't say from experience because Java was not my first language. I learned probably QBasic was my first language, and then I moved on to Visual Basic, and then I moved on to Java. And what I can say is that, by all means, Java is a very verbose language. There's a lot that you need to type in to make it work. And I've said this before, that a lot of people think of having a verbose language as being a bad thing. You need to do a lot of typing. It's very annoying. It's very complex. And for the most part, yes, that is true. It does make things a bit difficult, but you learn a lot more about the programming language that you're using. You learn a lot more about programming languages in general. Now, obviously, there's a tipping point there. Okay, because I suppose I could apply those same arguments to something like an assembly code language, assembly language. Assembly is horrible. Assembly is what I had to learn a little bit of it in university, and probably so many hours wasted doing that. But I learned a lot in terms of how computers actually work under the covers. Okay, when you learn about assembly code, it's pretty much as close as you can get to binary without ripping your hair out. So, like I said, there's a tipping point where you are just doing too much work for the rewards that you can get out of it. But I find Java does indeed strike a good balance. You learn a lot about programming concepts in general that you can apply to other programming languages, as well as still being able to get the job done in a reasonable amount of time. Now, obviously, I've learned Java, and I've been using Java for many, many years now, so I can get it done very, very quickly. Just the same could be said for someone who, maybe is an expert at assembly programming language. Okay, maybe that's just what they've used for ages and ages, and they can still go and hit the ground running and get things done quickly as well because they know it very well. So the long and short of the answer to answer the question is, yes, Java is a difficult first language to learn, but once you do learn it, you can go on and pretty much learn any programming language afterwards. So it really depends on your goals. If your goal is to just learn one programming language and then use it for the rest of your life, maybe Java is not the greatest way to go. Maybe, like he said, Python is a good way to go because Python is very easy to learn. Okay? But if you're looking to be able to apply the things that you've learned into other programming languages and keep, up to date with the growing technology field and all the different types of languages that are coming out, Java is a great language to learn. Not only is it great to learn because of the applications for, applying it to other programming languages, but also the sheer popularity of Java. It is constantly either the number 1 or number 2 or number 3 programming language in the world. It keeps, trading spaces with a whole bunch of other programming languages, but Java is always consistently at the top. Also, for pay scale, Java is always consistently at the top in terms of, getting paid as a programmer. So I'll say again, the long and short of it is, I believe the juice is worth the squeeze when it comes to the Java programming language, because not only are you going to learn something that you can take into the future with you forever, you can also use it to create a wealth of different types of programs and applications and web applications and true native apps inside of your desktop as well. You can do that, as well as migrate it over to the Android field. Android uses Java, okay? So you can create mobile applications as well. So it's a very diverse language. It opens up a lot of doors, a lot of opportunities, a lot of possibilities at very, very high pay scales as well. Okay, and the long and short of that is everyone's in it for the money. Okay, everyone wants to have a good career, to be able to make enough money to support their family and so on and so forth. So Java is a wonderful, wonderful thing to use to nail every single one of those nails in their heads to cover all your bases. Cool. So fair enough. That's my slightly biased answer to that question, but like I said, for those of you who are just only looking to learn one programming language because it's maybe a passing fad for you, Java's not a great place to start because it does get very confusing. Python will be a much better fit. Cool. Alrighty, so there we go. That'll about wrap up this episode of the How to Program with Java podcast. Thank you so much for joining. And like I said, check out the show notes page, howtoprogramwithjava.com/session65. Hop on over there and check out all of the great code and practice it yourself. Go in there and play around with the HTML that you have there and just see what happens. Again, use Google Chrome, use the developer tools by clicking the F12 key, hitting your F12 key on your keyboard, and just play around with it and see how it goes, and that's how we learn. Okay, we learn by doing. So by all means, do it. Get out there, practice it, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next episode of the How to Program with Java podcast. Bye for now.
Thanks for listening to the How to Program with Java podcast. Please visit howtoprogramwithjava.com for more useful Java tutorials.